Yes. Okay, we're live.
All right.
Okay, Carlos, thank you for joining me yet again on this live stream.
Yes, we're happy to be here today. Another beautiful Sunday here in Southern California.
Yeah, it was nice today.
Yeah,
Usually I'm a little cold at this point, but I'm not that cold. It's
pretty nice
7 o'clock.
although I've been inside all day working,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
working
How's the
through.
food bank going?
Well, everything is coming along. It's a lot of work right now that we are putting together. The stuff that I'm gonna be sharing some of that stuff, not tonight, but hopefully next Sunday we're gonna be talking about food insecurity, etc. But there's a lot of work that's being done right now throughout, and we're very excited that we're partnering with so many great organizations and creating, programs and what have you. But I don't want to bore you guys with that tonight. For you,
Well, I'm very excited to hear all about what you're working on next
yeah,
week, I guess. But this week we're going to talk about the renewable energy transition with respect to climate change, because right now, with everything that's going on with Ukraine and Russia, there's big discussion about how to end our dependency on fossil fuel, at least importing it from countries that are not doing the best things in the world. But before we get started, Carlos, we got to introduce the show.
yes, indeed, right now.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, or wherever you are in the world, at whatever time it is. It's evening where we're at. You're watching Stand Up Fight Back, where we discuss strategy and analysis for the progressive movement. I'm Margot Pies. I'm your co host. I'm a scientist, engineer, and occasional journalist. And over here, that's Carlos Marroquin, an absolutely phenomenal grassroots organizer and former mailman. And he is the other co host on this show. So, Carlos, okay. So,
Well, yeah,
let's get started.
everybody. Greetings, everybody, wherever you may be watching us from. Again, thank you, Margaret, for joining me and having this conversation. Very important conversation because, as we know, there is a full blown war going on right now in other parts of the world, but it's affecting, as you know, it's affecting many people. Many parts of the world is affecting. It's not just over in Ukraine or Russia. It's just literally everywhere. But that leads us into the conversation that we need to have. Is one conversation that we don't hear about. We hear the issues relating to war. We hear this and that, but not what brought us here. And about the same kind of wars that we fighting, time and time again over oil, over certain things that really affects everyone, but at the same time we're still living in the same system that continues to pull us down and continues to create opportunities for war and what have you, which are bad things because so many people get hurt and what have you. Big news. If you don't know this by now, I'm sure that you do, because when you take your car to go get a little gas, that's exactly what you're gonna get. It's a little gas because everything is skyrocketed, and that's part of it, has a lot to do with our discussion today.
Yeah, exactly. So, we're seeing massive inflation on energy prices. In fact, I was trying to get a plane ticket to go home. Well, not to go home, but to go back to school to Atlanta, to the university that I'm studying at. And it was so expensive for a one-way ticket. I had to book a couple of weeks in advance just to get a reasonable price. And when I flew home, it was sort of a sudden decision because I had a family emergency. I booked just like a day before, and that wasn't an issue. So, the fuel prices are starting to affect the airline ticket prices as well, and of course this is a cascading effect, right? Because fuel is necessary, energy is necessary for a lot of industries that produce various goods that we use on a regular basis. So I suspect that there's going to be a little bit of a ripple effect here, and we're just at the beginning of it. So they're calling this like the worst energy crisis since the energy crisis of the 1970s. the question that I was thinking about that today was, that energy crisis, the oil crisis in the 70s, effectively led into neoliberalism, sort of as a solution. Of course, this is all happening under neoliberalism. So what happens next, right? Because this is a failure again, and neoliberalism is partly to blame for this. So we'll see. But in the meantime, we have to figure out how to end our dependency on fossil fuels so that we don't have these kinds of wars, and so that we're not fighting over who's going to export or who's going to import some fossil fuel, right? Because if we're using renewable energy, we don't have to do that, because we can effectively source our renewable energy locally, and that's a big deal. But there are issues around the renewable energy transition. So, Carlos, I wanted to take some time today to go through some slides that I shared with the Progressive Democrats of America earlier today on their town hall. And it got pretty good reception. So, I'm hoping that it'll be useful for us, because we have to strategize around how to make certain policy changes if we want to have the renewable transition that we really desperately need, and if we want to do it in a reasonable time frame or even accelerate it, because these issues that we're facing with the renewable energy transition can really delay us, and we really can't afford to be so dependent on fossil fuels at this point in time.
And what is worse is that it is this same system that they are trying to protect that is a failed system, because again, this system, or continues to escalate wars. We have an arm race right now going on that can lead us into even World War III, in the accountable this system that they continue to try to protect, rather than us investing in new energy, and ending our dependency on oil. We continue to fight to protect the system that doesn't work. It just makes no sense. But when we understand that it will take time to transition, but we take one step forward and then we take 5 steps back. you know any step that that they try to take forward, it leads us to nowhere, are very symbolic. And I think that people are starting to catch on. And again, the prices continue to drive up. You feel it when you go to the gas station. You feel it when you're paying your bills. You feel it how you feel it when that high cost of energy is affecting everything else. So yes, we're ready to learn some things tonight, Margaret. I think it's very important for us to pay attention and understand that this is a system that doesn't work, and again, it needs to be changed. Tonight, we're going to learn a few things here. I hope we do.
I hope so too. I hope I don't bore you. But Carlos, let me know. I'm going to go ahead and bring up the slides here. Let's see, maybe I can make this a little bigger. Perfect. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. So let me know if anything I mentioned is confusing, because trying to understand the electrical grid is not easy. It's very complicated, and it's not cohesive.
But see, that's what happens, is that they make things so complicated that people they lose heart right away, and they rather stay in the system that exists right now, because it requires for us to pay attention. It requires for us to get involved. And some people just throw their hands up in the air and they say, forget it, let's just keep what we have. But keeping what we have is leading us not only into continuous wars, but also is creating a really economic downfall for the working class. All right, I think we lost Margaret, but again, we are going to be looking at some of the issues that are affecting us today in relation to the wars, and also the crisis that we face on energy. So there is so much that we need to understand happening, that again, these are the results of inaction by our leaders to take us into where we need to go, and that is into transition uh, from fossil fuels and those energies that
Yeah.
don't work.
Yeah, sorry about that. There's a bad plug outlet in this room and I keep plugging into it. So my apologies, but we're all set up here. Battery will be charging and we shouldn't have this problem again. So let me start over. Okay, so right, so we're going to look at and try to understand the renewable energy transition and figure out how we as progressives can fit into this transition and solve some of the problems that are happening. So this is going to be a little hard to understand at times because the electrical grid is a challenge to understand, even for myself. And so, Carlos, if you have any questions at all, just please stop me and I will do my best to answer them because I'm sure there will be things that are confusing.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, so let's get started. So again, I titled this talk "The Challenges in the Renewable Energy Transition from a Just Transition Perspective" because we progressives were really concerned about a just transition. That's part of the Green New Deal, and we have to make sure that all aspects of the Green New Deal or the Green New Deal address these issues if we really want to take everybody along with us from as we transition off of fossil fuels. So the biggest problem, Carlos, and to our audience, is that we have $5 trillion, at least $5 trillion in annual subsidies that go towards the fossil fuel industry. And this is on a global scale. So every year, governments are giving trillions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry. And what that does is it lowers the prices below what they're actually valued. So it's actually artificially making fossil fuels cheaper. So that's making them more competitive in a market where they should not be competitive. They should be priced out because they're too expensive compared to renewable energy. So the system is designed to keep fossil fuels alive. And two key points here that was from this 2019 IMF report. The first one is that the biggest polluters in the world are also the ones that are the biggest subsidizers of the fossil fuel industry. So China in 2015, $1.4 trillion worth of subsidies every year. The United States, more than half a trillion, $649 billion a year. I mean, that's pretty much like very close to the size of our defense budget. Russia, the European Union, and India are also among the top subsidizers in the world. And as I said, they're also the top polluters. So there's no coincidence there, right? We're propping up the very things that are making us also the worst polluters in the world. Mm-hmm. Now, if we had stopped our subsidies in 2015, the IMF report estimated that the global carbon dioxide emissions would have been 28% lower than they actually were. So these subsidies are putting more CO2 in the air and making the climate crisis worse. So this, for us as progressives, or anyone who cares about the climate, is one of the biggest things that we have to address. We have to change the policy around these subsidies. These are tax subsidies. These are, they're tax breaks for these fossil fuel companies. And so another problem that we have in this transition is getting rid of coal plants. So we're starting to see a few coal plants come back online, and we have to understand why that is happening. The reason why this is happening is because there's a just transition failure. These towns where these coal plants exist rely heavily on revenues from the plants to keep their cities going or their towns going. And also, when these coal plants go away, all of the jobs that the coal plants provided go with it. And these workers no longer have a job, and they likely will have to leave town to find a new one. So this is basically a death to these small towns. So that's a failure. That's a just transition failure. But the governments, instead of trying to create incentives to bring other jobs into these towns that don't pollute the environment are creating a new set of subsidies for data centers. And this isn't just happening in Wyoming, it's also happening in Democratic led states like Pennsylvania and New York. Even under former Governor Andrew Cuomo, he made it possible for a number of these subsidies to come through. And really, it's just to maintain, I think, just to maintain these revenues, these local municipal level revenues. So that's a problem. So here we have to address policy changes where instead of incentivizing keeping these plants alive to make sure that these jobs continue or to make sure that these towns have the revenue, we have to find ways to bring in new businesses into these towns or to provide some either a UBI or a guaranteed employment. So those are possible solutions so that we don't see coal plants coming back online. Okay, so this is the state of our energy grid, or I'm sorry, our energy mix in the United States. This starts in 1990 and goes to 2020. If you look closely, there's a little sliver of yellow as you approach 2020. That's our renewable energy. You see that while coal has decreased, natural gas has increased, and oil, biofuels, and nuclear have been pretty constant. And if you ask some people on the conservative side, they'll tell you that natural gas is the number one reason why the United States has lowered its CO2 emissions at all over the last decade. This is only half true because it's not considering the number of methane emissions that come from fracking or natural gas production. And the more we learn about the methane emissions, the more we realize that the industry is not doing a very good job of taking care of methane leaks. And then when these oil and natural gas wells go out of service, whether the company goes out of business or whatever, they're not being plugged. And so they are also leaking. And then thirdly, the transportation costs of the natural gas also emits CO2. So this isn't exactly true. And one other thing is that methane is 80 times more potent as a greenhouse gas for trapping heat in the planet. So it's 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So if we're ramping up natural gas, we're running the risk of adding an even worse greenhouse gas to the environment. So we have to deal with our natural gas dependency. And Carlos, talking about the war with Putin, this war is about natural gas pipelines, I think, and it's about who's going to be the exporter to Europe of these pipelines. Because before the war, there was a big struggle over the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which would connect Russia to Germany. It would be a second pipeline to provide gas to Germany. And the United States, for the last year or two, has been putting pressure on Germany to back out of this pipeline. And right before Putin invaded Ukraine, Putin signed, I think, like a 30-year gas deal with China. So they're going to be providing natural gas to China for at least 30 years. That's to 2050. And we don't need more of that. But that's just an example that this is all connected to the wars that we're seeing right now. So we have to find ways off of this.
Right. And we have to make it clear that this is not conspiracy. If you do your research, you'll find out that this is truth. That the dependency that Europe has on the oil that comes from Russia, etc. And you have all these major players that are involved, and are trying to move it from one source to another, and what have you. And we see right now one of the things that really we're paying attention to is the kind of sanctions that are being put in place, because everything is to be able to pressure Russia into complying to certain things, and be able to take certain market away from them. So it gets a little bit complicated and mixed, but you are correct, Marco. This is exactly what is going on.
Yeah. So we have to do something to make this renewable energy transition go by faster, because as you can see from this plot, we're barely making a dent with renewable energy, and that's a big problem, because the IPCC just released a report a few weeks ago saying that we already have losses and damages. There are already things that we've done because of our inaction that are irreversible and that are going to damage the lives of many people around the world. And we really cannot have that happen beyond what has already happened. Okay, so this is just showing the projections for growth over the next 30 years or so. So this is the non-OECD countries are basically non-Western countries. You can see that there's going to be a massive energy consumption growth because these are effectively developing nations that are growing. And they are also having population growth, which is tracking along with it. So these countries need more energy, and they want to raise the quality of life of their people up to similar standards to the United States. All that sounds okay, but the problem is that they're very likely to do this with coal. And I don't have this chart in the slide deck, but the IEA, which is the International Energy Agency, has a slide that shows projections of the energy mix like this one through
Right.
2050 globally. And the coal usage doesn't go down, because even though Western countries are ramping down coal use, these non-Western countries are ramping up. So that is a problem. And part of the problem has to do with investment risks in renewable energy. And I'm going to get into that as I move into talking about the electrical grid. Okay, so the IEA has a net zero plan, and you can see that this is their net zero pathway. You can see we need 4 times as much solar and wind capacity on the electrical grid. They're asking for 18 times as many electric car sales between 2020 and 2030. And they want to see better energy efficiency. So they call that energy intensity of GDP. So like you want to use less energy per dollar, let's say. Okay. There's ways to do that. You can electrify almost everything. And when you run things with electricity, it inherently creates efficiencies in energy use. So there's a book by a really fantastic engineer, very creative guy. His name is Saul Griffith. He wrote a book called Electrification, and I highly recommend that if you want to learn more about the path towards electrifying everything. And he also lays out a lot of policy ideas in that book. Okay, so the IEA report, though, it's important to note that it includes carbon capture in this whole picture. So you really can't see the words on the chart, but there's some boxes in there that say that there's going to be X amount of carbon captured by 2030, by 2045. So there's some problems, though, with this, right? Because we don't want carbon capture to extend the lifetime of fossil fuels. But all of these net zero models are including carbon capture. There are some reasons why we may want carbon capture, because there are industries that are difficult to decarbonize, like, for example, the cement industry. So those type of industries that are carbon intensive are not the ones that are necessarily being targeted right now, but are ones that likely will be addressed through these models that the agencies are producing through carbon capture. So we really have to think about how we're going to make that work in a way that it doesn't extend the lifetime of the fossil fuel industry, but at the same time doesn't minimizes CO2, because the IEA report not only includes industry consumption using carbon capture and storage, it's also talking about direct air capture. And there's problems with that because you have to store it under rock, and there's always the possibility that a leak could happen. And an analogous concern over that is thinking about the permafrost in the Arctic. As the permafrost melts, it will release methane into the atmosphere. And so the permafrost was great as a methane sink, but once it melts, it becomes a methane source. And again, we're back to a really horrible scenario if we put all that methane into the atmosphere. So it's sort of an analogous problem. Like, you can store that carbon underground, sure, but what happens if it leaks? What's the risk of it leaking? Like, all of this needs to be discussed. And there's a fantastic book around that by uh, uh, she's a geographer. Her name is Holly Jean Beck. She wrote a book called After Geoengineering, and she looks at geoengineering, including carbon capture plus like regenerative approaches using like seaweed and stuff in the book. And she gives a very left-leaning, objective perspective on it that I really recommend to anybody who's interested in carbon capture, not just with CCS technology. Okay, so these are the things that these agencies are thinking about when they're planning this renewable energy transition and moving towards net zero. Right, so as I said before, right now the goal is to decarbonize the electrical grid, basically because it's the low-hanging fruit. This is the easiest thing that we can do, plus all of the energy, fossil fuel combustion that is on that grid actually takes up the majority of the fossil fuel burning that we do. So we want to target that first and foremost. So that's why you see this blue line drop significantly as we approach 2040. So that's dropping by 2040 based off of the IEA modeling. This is not saying that this is happening now, but this is the goal. Okay, so now the electrical grid. If we're going to decarbonize it, we have to figure out what are the problems that we're facing with a renewable electricity grid, because they are different from a fossil fuel grid. In fact, there are newer, more somewhat challenging problems because renewable energy is intermittent. It only happens when the sun is available or when the wind is available. So our demand, like when I'm at home and I'm doing my laundry, I've got the refrigerator on, that doesn't always match with when peak energy is available on the grid. Okay, so this is the United States electrical grid. It's divided into three parts. You have the Western interconnection, which is basically the Southwest, the Northwest, California. Then you have the rest of the country, part of the Midwest going all the way to the East Coast. And then you have ERCOT, which is Texas. And they have a very unique system where they basically islanded themselves so that they could make it possible to have a deregulated, open electricity market. So these grids, these interconnections actually go all the way up to Canada. And so that means that we can actually share electricity across these two countries. Right, so the old grid, the conventional grid that was based off of fossil fuels, had something called inertia built into them because the fossil fuel power plants spin turbines to generate electricity. These turbines have a physical characteristic called inertia, which is basically stored energy. So that if a power plant goes down, then that energy is still sitting in that turbine as it's spinning. So it doesn't shut down immediately. And that was great for a grid operator because that gave them time to figure out how to bring on additional power to the grid to balance it, to make sure that there wasn't a drop in the amount of power on the transmissions line. And there's also something else that's a little more technical that's related to the frequency of the electricity that's moving through the electrical grid. So that made it easier to control and manage the grid in a centralized way. So this control was considered, or is considered, a supply side control. All you really need to do was just have those backup generators there at those natural gas peaker plants or coal peaker plants, whatever, and you'd bring them on because you would have enough time to deal with that. Okay, but now with a renewable energy grid, we have a little bit of a problem. So the more solar and wind you put on, the harder it is to control on the supply side, because the supply side is not always there. So you have to make adjustments, right? One is, of course, we can have batteries. There's some problems with that because batteries right now really only hold about 4 hours of power at the time. And these batteries, they don't last forever. Like, I mean, you can't just take the energy stored in the battery, let it sit there for months, and then use it in an emergency. It doesn't work that way. Those batteries over time are losing the energy that it's stored.
and,
Okay, so yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
and no, not only that, but those batteries also become a waste, that affects the environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
All this,
Yeah,
one thing leads to the other. So it's like it gets so complicated because this is exactly what's killing us.
right. We have to manage, of course, the disposal of the batteries. We have to manage disposal of the wind farm equipment, of solar equipment. All of that, yes, has to be addressed as part of this transition because we don't want to create an additional ecological crisis. So that's a really important point. So, yeah, so batteries are one part of this equation, but actually, a bigger part is, or a complementary part is demand side control of the grid. So what that means is having flexible demand on the consumer side or on the industrial scale side. And that means that maybe instead of us doing all of our electricity operation, between the hours of 6 and 10 p.m., we're spreading it out throughout the day, or we're bringing on additional demand through industry or energy intensive devices that can maintain that power so that it helps balance the grid, because there are some problems with having too much power on the grid. And then when demand peaks, that those devices can shut down and make power available when it's needed.
Right.
So there's different things. So Texas is unique because I mentioned Texas because they are already doing that, but that's because they're such a small grid. So once they start adding more and more renewables, those problems start to come up faster. But on the bigger grids over time, as we start approaching 50%, 60%, those same problems are going to happen nationwide. Okay, so these all require policy changes because it's not that easy to have that demand side flexibility right now given the existing policies.
Right.
Right. So this is from a study out of Berkeley Lawrence Livermore Lab, and they were looking at how much interest there is, first of all, in adding renewable power to the grid. And then they were looking at why is there so much congestion to actually get that power connected to the grid. So this has to do with the ability to connect your power project to transmission lines. So you have to do studies to do this. And these studies are taking a long time. They're cumbersome, and it's slowing down the ability to bring these renewable power plants online.
Mhm.
So we actually have an abundance of energy sources. That's not the problem. The study says that there was approximately 680 gigawatts of proposed generation that is zero carbon, right? So there's lots and lots of power available. But the problem is that they have to do these studies, and it's reducing the amount of plant projects that can come online. In fact, only 24% of these projects are coming online. So you have all sorts of power available, but only 24% of all of those possible projects end up being built because these wait times are getting longer. From 2000 to 2009, the wait time was approximately 2 years. From 2010 to 2020, it increased to 3.5 years. So that's a huge problem, especially if we want to accelerate this transition. These wait times have to be reduced. And the thing is that some of the locations where the best wind and solar are located are far away from where people live. So that means you have to build out the transmission lines to get that power to where people are. So these studies have to happen in order for them to be connected, like how much is it going to cost, what needs to be built, things like that.
Right.
So we need policy changes that can make this faster. The requirements for these studies are too complicated. And so then it turns off investment into these projects. And the United Nations, in a recent report, said that 80% of all of our renewable energy will be funded by the private sector. So that's nearly all of it. And if there are investment risks because it takes too long to get these power plants online, then there's going to be less interest in building them. And there's going to be more interest, right, in maintaining the fossil fuel industry. So we're extending that lifetime because we have this gridlock. And that's all just because of how the bureaucracy is built around these transmission studies.
But this is again, as we have said, this is the kind of system that they're trying to continue to protect, right? Even though that it has all kinds of issues that not delays change, but also are costly, are very costly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it's sorry. Actually, say that again, Carlos. I was
no. I'm saying these are the same issues. This is the same system that they continue to want to protect. That's what we have said earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Not only it takes long to make any kind of changes, but they are becoming very costly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's costly.
No matter how you see it, it's costly because they continue to want to push the same system that doesn't work.
Right. Yeah, it's costly. I mean, it's convenient, right? It's convenient that it takes so long to do these studies because it does extend the lifetime of the fossil fuel industry. So that's a great deal for them. Right. I mean, I don't know, like, to what extent the fossil fuel industry is involved in making it harder to change these policies. I don't know, but it may just be that, it's just a perfect situation because government cannot act because they're tied by all of these requirements. And so we actually have to loosen these requirements.
Well, one thing that we know for sure is that they have created for themselves safety nets to protect their system, so that it becomes harder for us to transition.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and this is
like the subsidies that I mentioned at the beginning. Those are mainly a result because of the banking industry and the fossil industry's extensive influence on politicians. So they are making these laws basically because they're getting paid to do it. There's the fossil fuel industry lobby Congress extensively. The banking industry does because it's a great way to make money off of credit, giving them loans. So all that money gets funneled towards the banking industry. From the banking industry into the fossil fuel industry. And so we start to see these plants staying alive for longer than they should be, or new plants coming online. In the Biden administration, instead of cutting out, rejecting all new fossil fuel contracts or offshore drilling, has actually approved them during his administration. So, the system is designed to keep the fossil fuel industry alive, and the politicians are very much captured in this regard and are doing the bidding of these industries. So in the meantime, while we're trying to make this transition happen, we're facing a lot of gridlock. I mentioned that before, in terms of being able to accelerate. It's not that we don't have the technology. We do. It's just that we can't get it online fast enough for these various reasons.
Right. Because, at the same time, and we need to make that clear, that this resistance is actually coming from both parties. They are the tools that the oil industry and that are using to create themselves those safety nets to protect them. Is through the politicians from both sides of the aisle.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, Democrats are definitely part of the problem in this as well. They get a lot of money from the fossil fuel industry as well. So they have an incentive to do the wrong thing. So it's just, yeah, it's a lot of bad incentives in this system at different levels that are causing the problem.
Right.
And like, okay, so here this plot is an example of solar on the grid in California. So this is as if solar, it was a sunny, like a perfectly sunny day in California. And then so what it looks at is how the demand is changing over time during the peak period of solar energy production. So you see that the plot is actually, as you go from 2012 through 2020, that it starts to take a dip and it looks like the belly of a duck. That's because there's so much solar power supply on the grid that their demand is lowered. So that pushes off a lot of the other plants, like let's say like natural gas, for example, because they getting, it's just too cheap to operate. And but it's also a problem for the solar industry because these prices during this time go into the negative dollar costs. So like, instead of being 3 cents per kilowatt hour, it's negative 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which means that the power plant is paying you to take the power off their hands. So in order to balance that, we have to shift demand into the belly of the duck away from where it peaks between 6 and 9 so that we can balance those energy prices. And when you balance the energy prices, it does make it more profitable for the power plants, right? But it has to be because that's an investment risk for the private sector. If they don't see a return on their investment because there's going to be too much power available, reducing their revenue to pay back their loans, they're not going to invest in this. Okay, so this is, of course, yeah, this is a result. We have a market, an energy market. If we chose not to have an energy market and the government took on those losses, that would be a different story. But as it appears, this is the route that we are going. So we have to deal with the market in this way. So here's just a geographical example of this. So we looked in California, right, with the duck curve. Okay, but you see Texas all the way through the Midwest. As the color goes from yellow to red to purple, that means that that's the percentage of wind and solar that's leading to these supply and demand mismatches, so that there's too much supply when there's low demand. Okay, so the reason why you see that there across the Great Plains is because the Great Plains is an exceptional source of wind power.
Right.
So the more that you put on, the more that you're going to have to deal with the excess energy. And that means that you have curtailment, which is that basically you have to throw away that energy. So the more power that's renewable that we put on the grid, the more of that power we have to throw away. So that's really bad in a market effectively. So we have to change these policies. We have to make it easier for demand side to come online. And we actually have to make the market more competitive in that sense. And there's a paper that I'll mention a little later that touches on how to do that. Okay. But this is just showing that the other problem is that if you don't have good grid connection where you can send that excess power to someplace else that's geographically farther away, then that energy, that power is effectively trapped. It's in prison and it's going to just die there, right? It's like it can't go anywhere. So you have to do something about it. Texas is unique in this sense, again, because literally the state of Texas is its own island electrical grid. So they can't sell their energy to California or to Wisconsin or New York. So they have had to really ramp up their demand side flexibility by bringing on more energy intensive loads during those peak periods. But as I said, this situation is going to happen across the country as we move towards higher renewable on the electrical grid. So Texas is really a first case study of what to expect nationwide. So again, we have to figure out how to compensate for this. One possibility is to have a fully integrated grid. But of course, we have to change certain policies as well to make that possible, because as it stands, all of the United States is not one grid, as I showed in that previous slide. So
Right.
so these are all, like, there's so many things that we have to change in order to speed up this renewable energy grid transition. And nobody's really addressing this publicly. I don't hear any politicians talking about this. And we need to really discuss this, and we need to have solid policy in government in order to promote these changes and to change old policies that were designed for a supply side grid. Okay,
Exactly.
so this paper, which I mentioned, talks about a just energy transition. So basically, again, moving away from the fossil fuel industry to a more decentralized grid that is renewable based, and then making it more inclusive for all industries to be, and all stakeholders to participate in the energy market, to make that demand side response possible, to make it more flexible. And then ultimately, this will lead to a just energy transition, at least in terms of who can participate, and it'll lead to sustainable growth and not growth at the expense of the environment. And the benefits and the disbenefits will be better distributed, rather than with the old grid, they're unequally distributed. So the paper goes on. Basically, this is just a quote from that paper where I got that flow chart from. Flexibility justice aims to have a flexible and dynamic energy sector where the marketplace is open to all stakeholders, and as a result, a market can take advantage of the flexibility technologies that are available. And let me just move our pictures here so I can see the rest of this text. This may require a change of existing market and policy structures that must keep pace with the current worldwide developments. Okay, so the other problem is that every energy market in every state is different from the other energy markets. So we actually need some kind of, I think, uniform policy across all of the states to make that a little bit easier, or at least make it so that the market is open to all stakeholders to participate. And this paper was looking at industrial scale demand flexibility, but I actually think that it's possible, or that it should happen, that this just energy transition should include everyday household consumers as well, where demand is flexible with regard to our washer and dryer, with regard to our water heaters, things like that, with regard to our air conditioners. And actually, some states already in the summertime have these demand response programs where you can enroll your AC, and the grid, the energy or utility company will install a smart sensor that every now and then will turn off your AC when demand is high. So that should be part of a just energy transition, is to distribute that amongst households as well. So this requires policy changes, especially I think in California, because in California we have two utilities that are monopolies. And these monopolies are fighting against homeowners, even at the scale of just bringing on rooftop solar. And we just saw that in this past year, where the utilities want to bring on these massive solar farms, and they don't want rooftop solar to compete with it. But after this discussion, I think you can see why they don't want rooftop solar to compete, because that adds more solar power to the grid during that duck belly region of the day. So that's bad for their prices. But this is completely counter of what we need to be doing, because we need to overbuild as much as possible. It's just that we need better demand side flexibility, but the power utilities in California are trying to monopolize that. And that's wrong. And that's going to hurt us on this energy transition. And it's also going to make it an unjust transition, because everybody should have an opportunity to play a role in a renewable energy transition and to be power independent if they want to be. If I want to run my house with solar, I should have the right to do that. And right now, this is a struggle that's happening in California, and we need policy to change to make sure that the utilities don't win out in that battle, because we're going to have a lot of problems in the future, in the near future, with our grid. Okay, so as I said, right, that's great at the industrial scale, but we really want to also look at building out community resilience. And I think that solar power is a really fantastic way to do this. And it's great for places where there isn't a lot of government involvement too. So in order to create community resilience, community independence, we need to be more imaginative, and we need to figure out how we can bring renewable energy to these parts of the world that have generally been neglected by their governments, or because they're too corrupt or whatever. So here's some really great ideas on this these are just basically newspaper clippings. Okay, you can use solar. If you raise the solar panels above the ground high enough, you can actually improve your growth of vegetables. You can grow crops more effectively because it provides shade and reduces water loss, which is absolutely fantastic, because due to climate change, the soil is not going to be able to hold moisture as well as it used to, because it's going to be warmer. So if you provide that shade, you're reducing the amount of sun hitting the soil. So the soil can retain more water, and that water is then available to your crops. So this is fantastic, because you can run these solar panels off grid, and the panels themselves aren't powering the growth necessarily, right, of these crops. Like, those panels are probably going to provide power to the local community. And then there's some really interesting experiments going on with solar panels, where you can actually put some special gel which traps moisture from the atmosphere and collects that water, and then you can use that water to grow your crops if you want to. So now you can live in a part of the world where maybe it's not that easy to get water, and you can capture it directly from the atmosphere, and then you can use that to grow your crops. And all of that is being powered by solar energy. Now, this to me is the most exciting aspect of what a renewable transition can look like, because this is empowering communities. So I'm thinking about like communities in the global south, like on the African continent, where they don't have power. I'm thinking about First Nations like the Navajo, or like First Nations in Canada, who are being forced to use coal or diesel generators, causing pollution and causing damage to their lungs and increasing diseases. So this is a part of the renewable energy transition and a just transition that we need to create policy around. Maybe we need a global fund that can help educate communities on how to use solar, because the thing is that the price of solar and batteries are going to continue to fall. And as they continue to fall, they become more and more affordable to the average person and to small communities. And so this is a moment in which we can really empower a lot of people and completely change the whole landscape and bring people out of poverty and bring people into a more just world, because there is a correlation between living longer and having access to energy, right? Energy has made it possible for us to have all sorts of innovation and to extend our lifetimes and to just have a better life, a more comfortable life. So this is really important. This is a really overlooked aspect of the renewable energy transition. So that's pretty much everything of my talk. And it's just to point out, Carlos, that if we really want to do this energy transition right, we have to do a lot of policy changes to make it happen. So if we don't want to have to deal with somebody like Vladimir Putin or have to rely on other countries for fossil fuels, then these issues have to be addressed, and progressives have to really think about them seriously if we really want to put an end to climate change, or at least to stop it from getting worse at this point. Oh, you're muted, Carlos.
Some of the stuff that come to mind is also how we are seeing uh, the space race. Uh, Even though that we're talking about space, all this is related because we see how they have changed a lot of the policies to be able to advance some of that space technology, but it's for private gain. It's not for the people. It's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They say that it is the people. They may use whatever, give them whatever subsidize and assistance, in being able to give them access to space and the all the studies and all the knowledge and blah 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 that the government already has. And now they not publicly saying this, but they are partnering with people like like Musk and what have you. But it's all about control. It's all about not giving access to everyone. And I see a lot of connections in a lot of these things because we are going to continue to struggle and not have what we need as humans, as a nation, as the working class. We're going to be depending on what they give us, and it's very problematic because again, out of this is the struggle that exists between nations, because everybody wants to control these energies. But we live in an age that people can have clean energy. They have the technology to do these things, but they're making it very impossible because,
Yeah.
again, it's the money.
Right. Exactly. And we really need to make it possible for anyone who wants to be energy dependent to be energy dependent as well, because that is part of a just transition, is having that choice too. So we don't want our renewable energy to be governed by monopolies like the
Right.
way our fossil fuel industry is. We want it to be democratic. So this is an opportunity for us to really jump on this, because this is just happening. So we still have the ability to shape the narrative, to influence the direction that it's going to go. And we have to really understand where all the problems are and where we fit in, but also to have a vision for what we can do with with renewable energy just on the local level. So that's really important. So I'm hoping that progressives will take this seriously and consider it as part of the bigger goals around climate change. Right? It is
Right.
yeah, it's important for us to demand the governments take action to stop us from surpassing 1.5 degrees Celsius. But it is also important for us to understand what the renewable transition looks like, where the problems are, so that we can put pressure on those things too.
Exactly. What are our friends from PDA saying regarding this stuff, and what are they suggesting that we need to do?
Right. So I gave this talk to them earlier in the afternoon, and I think a lot of the stuff that I shared with them, they had never seen before. They didn't realize that there was so much complexity, maybe, or that renewable energy really isn't a one-to-one with conventional fossil fuels. Because again, like you can run a coal plant 24/7, no big deal. You just keep feeding it coal and you just keep burning it. But you can't run a solar farm 24/7. It only runs when the sun is out. You can only run a wind farm when it's windy. But luckily, solar and wind is complementary for the most part, but you have to have both on the grid, and they have to be well distributed geographically. And then you also have to, store store that energy in batteries, or you convert it to some other fuel like hydrogen. And these are all things that are a little bit more challenging than
Right.
fossil fuels. And I tried to tell them to maybe reconsider some of their stances on nuclear and on hydroelectric, because, and I didn't quite touch on the reason why, but the thing is that those are turbine based, and they are effectively 24/7 uptime. So if you want to balance out, if you're not doing demand side effectively, you can balance that out with with nuclear plants or with hydroelectric plants, so that they can come online if there's a gap in demand, in the amount of power on the grid to meet demand when it peaks. So they are very much opposed to it, but I'm hoping maybe they at least see that at least during this transition, we shouldn't decommission the plants right away, at least not until we have the demand side flexibility sorted out.
And I
So
could I could already hear a lot of people like, "What are you talking about? Oh my God, you guys are promoting nuclear,
yeah,
and no, it's not that. But we got to be realistic. A
exactly.
certain period that needs to take place. But if we don't have something in place right now, if we don't have these things, it's like, how is it gonna get done? Because they are not gonna just erase something. It's like
Yeah.
done in a way that works. But we got to start somewhere.
Yeah, and the other thing that I didn't mention, mostly because we didn't really have a lot of time to discuss about hydroelectric plants, is that hydroelectric for some parts of the world is their majority power generator for their country, especially like, let's say, in Brazil or parts of Africa in their countries there. Hydroelectric is the renewable energy that they have. So if you're telling them don't build out your hydroelectric, or that these hydroelectric plants don't exist, you're forcing them onto coal, basically. And that's not what we want to do.
Right, but they're not gonna do it. This is, they look at, as much as we hate it, they have a right to use whatever they think they use. Is how do we convince them? How do we transition? What are we offering them to be able to get away from that energy that is killing us or that is destroying the environment? It's
Right.
like it has to go hand in hand. Not just saying, well, it's wrong. We know it's wrong, but what are we doing to be able to transition? It's the same thing with the political power. We know that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, are sold out to these big industries, but they are not just going to walk away from it, even though that they know that they're wrong. It's like we have to be able to advocate for ways that we can you know replace that, replace some of these politicians. That means that
Yeah.
we for office. That means that we have to be creative into creating policies,
Right,
right?
right. And we
Yeah,
need to take over these energy boards. And like in California, we need to take over them. We need to take over the ones that are overseeing the rulemaking for how the grid operates.
right,
Because the people who are making those decisions are operating on behalf of the monopoly utilities, especially in California.
exactly.
So we it's not just school boards, it's not just being the mayor of the city. It's literally taking over every particular aspect of local government, including those boards that govern the rulemaking on these grids, and then also informing our Democrats or progressive Democrats who run for office and who do get elected, informing them on these challenges, because I guarantee that the vast majority of them, maybe 90% of them, have no idea. They have no idea what is going on with the energy transition and the challenges that are arising because of bad incentives to fossil fuel industry, and because, well, solar is so cheap and so abundant, actually, that it's creating a fall in prices, which actually is a good thing. But there's just that you need to meet the supply with the right demand at the right time. So yeah,
But
so we have to balance
the
that.
other side to this is that, let's say that you have a politician, a progressive politician that understands all these things, you know. But then, on the other hand, we have progressives that are very hardcore to the left, and they only see one thing, and they tunnel vision, and they don't understand the powers that clash in Washington. That you may be a good politician that understand these things, but you cannot do it alone. You need the public support. You need, you know, the progressives to be able to stand there and support. But the problem that I see is that a lot of times progressives, they feel that, look, if you don't vote the way I say it, or if you don't do it the way we think you should do it, then you also corrupt. You already sold out. We have to understand the power structure that exists right now. That we are a minority. In Washington, progressives are a minority. You cannot just go in there and change things. It's like they're gonna fight you. They're gonna push back against anything that you're trying to bring to change. So this is the power struggle that exists, and we need to understand that so that we, offer, long time support and be, uh, and work with our politicians, not criticize them. Yes, we can criticize them, but also, you know, understand that we need to stand behind them. And it's not easy to bring changes in Washington. It's not easy. And I feel bad for those politicians that are trying to do the right thing and they get criticized because, uh, they don't, some progressives may think that they are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Is we need to understand that Washington is not asking and is not ready for these changes, and it's going to be hard. The battles to make these policy changes are not easy. Are
Right.
not easy.
Yeah, I mean, look at the struggles we're facing right now with the Senate, right? I mean, it's
Right.
almost impossible to change anything. And yeah, there's problems. There's regulations actually that are getting in the way, that are making it way too difficult even for a homeowner to make the transition. For example, I was reading an op-ed today that highlighted a story from a climate activist, a climate researcher named Leah Stokes. I think she works on the economic side or sociology side, something like that, climate change. And she was trying to retrofit her home to install a heat pump. And the city was making it so difficult for her to do that. There were so many rules and inspections, and it was going to take literally a year for her to do it. And in the meantime, she has to rely on natural gas.
Right.
And so in a place in the country where people are really concerned about the climate, have the ability to make changes to their homes, to reduce their energy consumption, increase energy efficiency by electrifying their heating at home, they're running into problems.
Right.
So there are some areas that are overregulated. And my understanding is that part of the reason why is because, I guess, maybe sometime during 50s, 60s, and 70s, the government was actually making it too easy to bring on, I guess, maybe like the technology that was harming the environment. So some of these regulations that environmentalists fought for were meant to slow that process down. But then they didn't take the extra step to fix the situation so that the government on this end could stay flexible and adapt. So right now, the government, the policies are not adapting, and it's
Be-
stopping us at all levels from making this transition.
because they cannot easily change from one thing to the other. It has to be a transition, and that requires different systems. Implementing a system, to replace another one, is like you cannot just shut down everything.
Right.
It has
Yeah.
to be, and this is the kind of stuff that it requires intense understanding of this, and being able to come up with solutions. Look, for example, just the problem that exists with Medicare for all, the healthcare industry. We know it doesn't work. We know that it leaves millions of people out. You know, some politicians, they know it too, but they cannot make the transition. They're having a hard time, you know what I mean, making that, because in one hand we have the healthcare industry creating policy, you know what I mean, in Washington, just like the banks create policy right? In the for to to pretty much control the housing market. We have banks controlling policy, writing the law. They have again, you have people that are dedicated to this from the industries, and we need to work at so many levels. But goes to show that we understand what's at stake, but we also understand that we need to be more strategic, and we need to be more involved at all levels, at all
Right.
levels, and
Yeah.
support people are trying to bring these changes.
Exactly, exactly. And to your point about, the banks getting in the way and not being able to change things around housing. I mean, there's another component to all of this as well, which is financialization. And
Mhm.
financialization has harmed so many aspects of society by basically turning us into this, by centering the market itself. Instead of having a human centered economy, we have a market centered economy. So now this market is governed by finance. So all of these industries are geared towards making money off of interest or off of trading, basically wealth out of wealth, instead of actually out of innovation or manufacturing. So, like with climate change, for example, financialization has really harmed us in the sense that we have like these carbon credit markets. And basically, you're turning forests in the global south into these virtual assets where you can buy and sell, squares of forest, and then you can claim, oh, I'm actually, green because I'm offsetting with some forest that I'm helping grow. But actually they're still polluting, and it's very damaging, especially in the global south. And they're allowed to get away with it, and that's partly because of financialization, or mainly because of the financialization of nature. And then also uh the let's see, so the other thing is innovation. On the innovation side, because it's a lot easier to put money into the stock market or into these assets, trading
Mhm.
like derivatives, it there's no point in investing in industry anymore. So if we really want to be innovative and fund new technologies that will get us away from technologies that are damaging society, we need to stop financialization, because the money isn't going there. Investors are like, you know what? Why bother? Why bother with research and development when I can make more money on the stock market?
Exactly, because
Yeah,
they're incentive for them to do anything that is going to actually help humanity, because their
right.
whole concept, again, capitalism is making money. It's
Yeah,
all, it's
yeah.
people, profit before people. And that's the thing that has always killed us, is the fact that these are the people that are controlling all these systems.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, we can have a whole discussion about financialization and climate change, Carlos. That's a whole another really important discussion to have, because it is really a big problem. And, these subsidies are part of that too, I think. I mean, effectively, it's neoliberal policies that have harmed us in ways that are just horrible across the board, and by
Right.
promoting these monopolies in all sorts of markets where they shouldn't exist. And ultimately, I think that if we let neoliberalism solve this problem, we will perish, because
They're not going to
their
solve.
their solutions are not actually based in the real world. So yeah. So Carlos, I think we're a little over time now. We should probably wrap up.
Yes, we are. But
Yeah.
thank you, everybody, for watching tonight. We needed to understand what's going on in this world of energy, etc., and some of the stuff that we need to be looking for and considering, because it's not going to get any better, unless we start like pushing in the right direction and understanding, first of all, understanding where we at and what needs to happen in order for us to bring the necessary changes. But so happy to be here tonight, Margaret. Thank you so much for this lesson that we learned today on and energy and the systems, etc. And good to see you. And I hope your dad is doing much better.
Oh yeah, yeah, he's coming home this week, so we're very happy about that.
Great,
Yeah, thank
great.
you.
Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. From here, from Los Angeles, I'm in Hollywood, California. But we want to say that we appreciate your support, your continued support, and stay strong. Don't give up because the best is yet to come.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise still out there for us, but we need to really understand how to do that and have a vision for the future. So, really excited to share those ideas with all of you. And we'll see you again next week on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Pacific Time, 10 p.m. Eastern Time. You've been watching Stand Up Fight Back, where we discuss strategy and analysis for the progressive movement. We'll see you again next week. Have a wonderful week, and please stay safe and enjoy the nice spring weather that's coming your way. Right, take care, everybody. Have a great night.